Dim the lights and settle in. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a secret so dangerous that knowing it could get you executed. A secret whispered in corridors of power, written in coded letters, and buried with the bodies of those who tried to expose it. A secret that toppled a kingdom that had stood for 300 years, that sent thousands to their graves, and that changed the map of Europe forever. The kingdom was mighty. The secret was small, but by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. This is the story of how one hidden truth, kept by just a handful of people, unraveled an entire civilization. And the most terrifying part? The people who kept the secret thought they were saving the kingdom. They thought they were protecting it. They had no idea they were sealing its doom. Hold in your mind the image of a crown. Not a golden crown gleaming in sunlight, but a crown in shadow. Magnificent to look at, but hollow inside. Beautiful on the outside, but rotting from within. That crown is our symbol tonight, and by the end of this story, you'll understand why the most dangerous secrets are the ones we keep to protect the things we love. The thesis we'll return to again and again is this: the secret that saves you today becomes the lie that destroys you tomorrow. Our story begins in a kingdom we'll call Valdoria, a composite drawn from real medieval kingdoms, whose falls followed remarkably similar patterns. Picture a land of rolling hills and ancient forests, of stone castles perched on rocky heights, of market towns bustling with trade. The year doesn't matter as much as the season. It's the autumn of Valdoria's existence, though no one knows it yet. To everyone living through these years, the kingdom seems as permanent as the mountains, as enduring as the rivers that cut through its valleys. Valdoria had been born 3 centuries earlier from the vision of a warrior king named Theodoric the Unifier. He was a minor lord who, through brilliance and brutality, had conquered 12 feuding territories and forged them into a single kingdom. What made Theodoric different from the dozens of other ambitious warlords of his age was not his military skill, though he had that, but his understanding of what comes after conquest. Anyone can take a throne by force. The trick is keeping it. Theodoric created a system of governance that was, for its time, remarkably sophisticated. He divided his new kingdom into provinces, each ruled by a governor he appointed personally. These governors were not the old nobles whose lands he had conquered. Those men he either killed or reduced to powerless figureheads. Instead, Theodoric chose his governors from among his most loyal soldiers and the sons of merchants, men who owed everything to him and nothing to the old order. This was revolutionary. It broke the traditional power of the landed aristocracy and created a new class of administrators whose authority came not from birth, but from the king's favor. The genius of the system was its incentive structure. Governors served 5-year terms. If they governed well, if tax revenues increased, if trade flourished, if the people didn't rebel, they were rewarded with wealth and higher appointments. If they failed, they were replaced and their families lost status. This created fierce competition among the governors and fierce loyalty to the crown, because the crown was the source of all advancement. A governor in Valdoria could not pass his office to his son. He could not build a hereditary power base. His power lasted only as long as the king's approval. Theodoric also established the royal auditors, a corps of inspectors who traveled the kingdom, examining the governor's records, interviewing citizens, and reporting directly to the king. The auditors were rotated frequently so they couldn't be bribed or develop loyalty to any region. They answered to no one but the monarch. This system of checks and balances kept the governors honest and kept the king informed. Information flowed up from the provinces to the capital, and power flowed down from the throne to the governors. It was a machine, and it ran smoothly for generations. Theodoric understood one more crucial thing: legitimacy requires more than force. He positioned himself not as a conqueror, but as a defender of civilization against chaos. He patronized the church, building magnificent cathedrals and endowing monasteries. He established courts of law where even peasants could seek justice against their lords, a radical innovation that made him beloved among common people and feared among nobles. He created royal roads connecting all corners of his kingdom, facilitating trade and military movement. He standardized weights and measures, created a common coinage, and established royal markets where merchants from across Europe came to trade. Under Theodoric, Valdoria became rich, stable, and powerful. When Theodoric died after a reign of 43 years, his system proved its worth by surviving him. His son took the throne smoothly, then his grandson, then his great-grandson. For 3 centuries, the dynasty continued, and the system Theodoric had built continued with it. Valdoria became one of the great powers of medieval Europe, a kingdom that could field armies of 10,000 men, that could build cathedrals that touched the sky, that could mint gold coins accepted in markets from London to Constantinople. But here's what no one understood at the time. The very system that made Valdoria strong was also making it brittle. The governors competed fiercely, yes, but they also learned to game the system. They learned to make their provinces look prosperous on paper, while extracting crushing taxes from the people. They learned to bribe the auditors or to create double sets of books. They learned to present glowing reports to the throne while conditions on the ground deteriorated. And because advancement depended on appearing successful rather than being successful, the incentive was always to hide problems rather than solve them. The kings of Valdoria, sitting in their palace in the capital, receiving reports that showed a kingdom running smoothly, had no idea that the reality beneath the reports was increasingly grim. The system that was designed to give them perfect information had become a machine for producing perfect lies. And because each king had been raised on these lies, each king believed them. The kingdom seemed strong because everyone with power had a stake in maintaining the illusion of strength. This is where our secret begins to take shape. It's not a single secret yet, but 1,000 small secrets, 1,000 little deceptions that the governors and the auditors and the ministers all keep, because keeping them serves their interests. The reports are falsified, but only slightly. The tax revenues are exaggerated, but not outrageously. The problems are minimized, but not entirely hidden. Each individual deception seems small, justifiable, harmless. But they accumulate like snowflakes in an avalanche, each one adding to the weight. None of them individually responsible for the disaster that's building. Let's focus now on a specific moment, a specific king, and a specific governor, because this is where the secret crystallizes from a diffuse culture of deception into a single, fatal, hidden truth. The king is Aldrich III, who takes the throne in what should be the prime of Valdoria's power. Aldrich is 32 years old, tall and handsome, educated and pious, everything a medieval king should be. He has been raised in the palace, trained from childhood to rule, and he loves his kingdom with genuine passion. He believes, completely and sincerely, in the system his ancestor Theodoric created. He believes in governance by merit, in justice for all classes, in the glory of Valdoria. What Aldrich doesn't know, what he cannot know, because no one will tell him, is that the kingdom is broke, not poor, broke. The royal treasury, which according to all official reports holds enough gold to fund the kingdom for years, actually holds approximately 3 months of operating expenses. The rest is gone, spent by Aldrich's father and grandfather on wars and building projects and the maintenance of a court whose magnificence was meant to demonstrate Valdoria's wealth, but instead consumed it. The secret that destroyed the kingdom was this: Valdoria was bankrupt, and no one would tell the king. How did this happen? How does a kingdom lose its wealth without the king noticing? The answer lies in the same system that had made Valdoria great. The ministers of the treasury, whose job was to manage the kingdom's finances, understood that telling the king the truth would mean admitting they had failed in their duties. Admitting failure meant losing their positions, losing their wealth, losing their status. So, instead of admitting the problem when it was small and fixable, they hid it. They presented false accounts. They borrowed money secretly from foreign banks, using the kingdom's credit, which was still good because everyone believed Valdoria was rich. They used the borrowed money to cover the shortfall, and they reported to the king that all was well. At first, this worked. The ministers planned to restore the treasury through increased tax revenues or by reducing expenses. But increasing taxes required the cooperation of the governors, who resisted because higher taxes made their provinces harder to govern. And reducing expenses meant cutting the lavish court ceremonies and building projects that the king believed demonstrated Valdoria's greatness. The ministers couldn't cut expenses without the king noticing, and they couldn't raise enough taxes to cover the deficit. So they borrowed more, and more, and more. The debt grew like a cancer, hidden from view, destroying the kingdom from within. The ministers kept 2 sets of books, one showing the truth, hidden in a locked chest in the treasury vaults, and one showing what the king expected to see, presented at every official audit. The auditors who examined the book saw only the false accounts. The king, when he reviewed the treasury reports, saw only prosperity. Everyone with access to the truth that had a stake in maintaining the lie, because revealing the lie would destroy them. This is the paradox at the heart of our story. The system designed to prevent exactly this kind of deception had created the perfect conditions for it. Because everyone's position depended on appearing successful, no one could afford to reveal failure. Because information flowed through official channels that could be controlled, the truth could be buried. Because the king trusted his system, he never thought to question it. The very mechanisms meant to protect the crown had become the instruments of its deception. But the price hadn't yet been paid. The secret was stable as long as the debt could be serviced, as long as the foreign banks kept lending, as long as no crisis required Valdoria to demonstrate its actual financial strength. And for 15 years after Aldrich took the throne, no such crisis emerged. The kingdom seemed to prosper. The king believed in his kingdom's strength. The ministers breathed a little easier each year they managed to keep the secret. Perhaps, they told themselves, they would find a way out of this. Perhaps revenues would increase. Perhaps some miracle would save them. Perhaps the secret could be kept forever. Then came the war. Not a war Valdoria started, but a war it couldn't avoid. The neighboring kingdom of Estermarch, led by an ambitious young king named Henrik, invaded Valdoria's northern provinces with an army of 8,000 men. The cause of the war doesn't matter. Border disputes, old grievances, the usual justifications that medieval kings used when they wanted someone else's land. What matters is that Valdoria had to respond. A kingdom that failed to defend its territory would invite more invasions, would lose legitimacy, would unravel. Aldrich had no choice but to raise an army and drive the invaders out. This should have been straightforward. Valdoria was, according to all reports, far wealthier and more powerful than Estermarch. The kingdom had a professional military apparatus, veteran commanders, fortified border castles, and a treasury that could fund a long campaign. On paper, Valdoria should have crushed Estermarch like an insect. Aldrich called his ministers together and ordered them to prepare for war. He would raise an army of 15,000 men, march north, and teach Henrik a lesson about invading Valdoria. The ministers bowed and promised to make it happen. Then they went back to the treasury and confronted the reality they had been hiding for decades. They didn't have the money to field an army of 15,000. They didn't have the money to field an army of 10,000. They barely had enough money to equip and supply 5,000 men for a 3-month campaign, and even that would require borrowing more from the foreign banks. And the banks were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about Valdoria's ability to repay its existing debts. The ministers faced a terrible choice. They could tell the king the truth, reveal the bankruptcy, and almost certainly be executed for their deception. Or they could continue the lie, promise the king his 15,000 men, and somehow scrape together enough of an army to win the war quickly before the lack of resources became obvious. If they won quickly, they reasoned, they could seize Henrik's treasury, use that gold to replenish Valdoria's coffers, and perhaps the secret could be saved. It was a desperate gamble, but it seemed like the only option that didn't end with their heads on spikes. So the ministers lied. They told King Aldrich that preparations were underway for a magnificent army. They sent orders to the governors to raise troops. And then they engaged in a frantic scramble to assemble an army on no budget. They cut corners everywhere. They hired cheap mercenaries instead of professional soldiers. They bought inferior weapons and armor. They reduced rations. They shortened the training period. They promised the soldiers payment they knew they couldn't deliver. They created an army that looked impressive in parade formation, but was hollow, untrained, poorly equipped, and already resentful about the broken promises regarding pay. Aldrich, inspecting his army before the march north, saw 15,000 men in formation and believed he had been given what he asked for. The ministers had assembled the bodies. What they couldn't assemble was the fighting spirit, the training, the equipment, or the loyalty. But Aldrich didn't know that. He saw the numbers and believed in them, the way he believed all the numbers his ministers gave him. The secret had spread like a disease from the treasury to the army itself. The appearance of strength masked the reality of weakness. The campaign began in spring, with Aldrich riding at the head of his army, banners flying, trumpets sounding, his confidence absolute. He expected to crush Henrik's forces in a single decisive battle and return home victorious before summer ended. The Chronicles of Valdoria, written by court scribes who believed what the king believed, described the departure as glorious, the army as magnificent, the outcome as certain. But here's what happened instead. The army marched slowly because the supply train was inadequate and kept breaking down. The soldiers grumbled about their poor rations and their missing pay. The mercenaries, who fought for money rather than loyalty, began deserting before the first battle was even joined. By the time Aldrich's army reached the northern border, it had already lost 2,000 men to desertion and disease. The soldiers who remained were demoralized, hungry, and increasingly mutinous. When Aldrich finally met Henrik's army in battle, in a meadow outside a town whose name has been lost to history, the result was catastrophic. Valdoria's soldiers, poorly trained and poorly equipped, facing an enemy who was desperate and well-prepared, broke and ran. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. 5,000 of Aldrich's men were killed, captured, or deserted. The king himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing south with the remnants of his army. Henrik's forces pursued, capturing castle after castle in Valdoria's northern provinces, meeting almost no resistance because the garrisons had been stripped to raise Aldrich's army. The defeat was total, humiliating, and inexplicable. How could mighty Valdoria lose to tiny Estermarch? The answer was the secret. The kingdom everyone believed was strong was actually hollow. The wealth everyone believed existed was actually debt. The system everyone believed was working had been lying for decades. And now, in the harsh light of military defeat, the lies were starting to unravel. Aldrich returned to his capital in shock, his confidence shattered, his understanding of his kingdom revealed as fantasy. He demanded answers from his ministers. How could this have happened? Where was the gold he had been told was in the treasury? Where was the professional army he believed existed? Where was the strength of Valdoria? The ministers, cornered, had nowhere left to hide. They confessed. They brought out the real books, the ones showing the true state of the treasury. They showed the king the debts, the false reports, the decades of deception. They fell to their knees and begged for mercy. Aldrich's response was swift and furious. He had the ministers arrested. He ordered them executed for treason, for deceiving the crown, for destroying the kingdom through their lies. Their heads were mounted on spikes outside the palace as a warning, but killing the ministers didn't solve the problem. The debt was still there. The army was still destroyed. The northern provinces were still occupied. And now, with the truth exposed, the foreign banks called in their loans. Valdoria couldn't pay. The kingdom's credit collapsed overnight. No one would lend to Valdoria anymore. The kingdom that had seemed so wealthy was revealed to be destitute, but the catastrophe was just beginning. When news of Valdoria's bankruptcy spread, and it spread fast because medieval courts were full of spies and merchants who dealt in information as well as goods, other kingdoms saw opportunity. If Valdoria was weak, its lands could be seized. If its treasury was empty, its armies couldn't be raised. If its credit was destroyed, it couldn't hire mercenaries. Within months of Aldrich's defeat in the north, 2 more neighboring kingdoms invaded from the east and west. Valdoria, which had stood for 3 centuries as a great power, was suddenly fighting for survival on 3 fronts with no money, no army, and no allies. Aldrich tried everything. He raised taxes, but the people, already burdened and now learning that their king had been lied to for decades, rebelled. Peasant uprisings erupted in a dozen provinces. The governors, without royal support or resources, couldn't suppress the rebellions. Some governors abandoned their posts and fled. Others tried to make deals with the invading armies, offering to switch sides in exchange for keeping their positions. The kingdom fragmented. The system Theodoric had built, which had seemed so stable, collapsed in less than 2 years. Aldrich, desperate, turned to the church. He begged the Pope to declare a crusade to defend Christian Valdoria against its attackers. But the Pope, who was dealing with his own problems and who had lost respect for Valdoria now that its weakness was exposed, declined. He sent prayers but no soldiers, blessings but no gold. Aldrich turned to other Christian kingdoms, offering alliances, marriage pacts, anything. But why would a strong kingdom ally with a weak one? The offers were politely declined. Valdoria was on its own. In the third year after the initial defeat, Aldrich himself was killed, not in battle but by assassins sent by one of his own governors, who had decided that killing the king and offering the crown to Henrik of Estermarch might be a path to survival. With Aldrich dead, the dynasty ended. There was no heir old enough to rule. The kingdom dissolved into civil war as various nobles, governors, and foreign kings all claimed authority over pieces of what had been Valdoria. The capital was besieged, sacked, and burned. The palace where Aldrich's ancestors had ruled for 3 centuries was looted and left in ruins. Within 5 years of the secret's exposure, Valdoria no longer existed as a kingdom. Its territories were divided among the neighboring kingdoms that had conquered it. Its people became subjects of foreign kings. Its system of governance, once admired and envied, was dismantled and replaced. The map of Europe was redrawn. Where there had been 1 kingdom, now there were pieces of 4. The name Valdoria survived only in chronicles and histories, a cautionary tale about the kingdom that seemed mighty but was hollow inside. So what happened? How did a secret, just the concealment of financial weakness, destroy an entire kingdom? Let's unpack the mechanism of this destruction, because it reveals something profound about power, truth, and the nature of systems. The first thing to understand is that secrets are like cracks in a foundation. A building can stand on a cracked foundation for years, even decades, as long as no unusual stress is applied. But when stress comes, an earthquake, a flood, a heavy wind, the crack becomes the point of failure. Valdoria's secret was the crack, and the war with Estermarch was the stress. The kingdom had been standing on a false foundation of lies and hidden debts, and when military crisis demanded real strength, the false foundation couldn't support the weight. The second thing to understand is that systems of governance are built on information flows. A king makes decisions based on the information he receives. If the information is accurate, he can make good decisions. If the information is false, even the wisest king will make catastrophic choices. Aldrich wasn't a bad king. He was a competent, well-intentioned ruler who made rational decisions based on what he believed to be true. He believed his kingdom was wealthy, so he raised a large army. He believed his army was professional, so he expected to win the war. Every decision he made was reasonable given the information he had. But the information was lies, so every decision led toward disaster. The third thing to understand is that secrets create incentive traps. Once the ministers started lying about the treasury, they couldn't stop, because stopping meant confessing, and confessing meant punishment. So they had to lie more to cover the first lies, and then lie even more to cover those lies. The deception became self-sustaining, a trap that the ministers couldn't escape. Even when they knew the war would expose the truth, they couldn't admit it beforehand, because admitting it was just as dangerous as being caught. They were locked into a course of deception that they knew would probably end badly, but that they couldn't abandon without guaranteeing immediate disaster. The fourth thing to understand is that trust, once broken, cannot be easily restored. When the truth about Valdoria's finances emerged, it destroyed not just the current government, but faith in the system itself. The people had believed their kingdom was strong, the nobles had believed the crown could protect them, the foreign creditors had believed Valdoria was solvent. When all of that was revealed as lies, no one trusted anything anymore. Even if Aldrich had survived and tried to rebuild, who would have believed his promises? Who would have lent him money? Who would have served in his army? The revelation of the secret destroyed trust, and without trust, no government can function. The fifth and perhaps most important thing to understand is that the secret was kept, initially, for good reasons. The ministers who first concealed the financial problems weren't evil schemers. They were loyal servants who believed they could fix the problem before it became serious. They thought they were protecting the kingdom by preventing panic, by maintaining confidence, by buying time to find solutions. They told themselves they were doing the right thing, and maybe, in the beginning, they were. Maybe if they had succeeded in restoring the treasury through prudent management, their deception would have been justified. But good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, and the road from temporary concealment to prevent panic to catastrophic systemic deception is shorter and smoother than anyone wants to believe. This is why the secret that saves you today becomes the lie that destroys you tomorrow. The minister's secret was meant to save the kingdom, and for a while, it did. It prevented a financial panic that might have caused immediate crisis. It maintained Valdoria's credit and its reputation. It bought time, but over the years, the secret transformed from a protective deception into a destructive lie. The longer it was kept, the more damage it did, the more systems it corrupted, the more people it entrapped. By the time it was finally exposed, it had become fatal. The kingdom might have survived bankruptcy if it had been revealed and addressed early, but it couldn't survive the bankruptcy, plus the decades of lies, plus the sudden collapse of trust, plus the simultaneous external invasions that the exposed weakness invited. Let's zoom out now and look at what happened after Valdoria fell, because the aftermath is instructive. The kingdoms that conquered Valdoria's territories learned from its collapse. They reformed their own systems to prevent similar deceptions. They created independent audit offices that reported to royal councils rather than just to the king. They required multiple signatures on treasury withdrawals. They mandated public accounting of royal finances. They established term limits for treasury officials to prevent the accumulation of long-running deceptions. These reforms, born from the observation of Valdoria's fall, made medieval governance more transparent and more resilient. But the reforms also made governance more cumbersome, more bureaucratic, more resistant to quick action. There's always a trade-off. Systems that prevent deception often also prevent decisiveness. Systems that maximize transparency often sacrifice efficiency. The kingdoms that learned from Valdoria's fall became harder to deceive, but also harder to govern. Whether that trade-off was worth it is a question that each kingdom had to answer for itself. The church also drew lessons from Valdoria's collapse. Theologians wrote treatises on the sin of deception, on the moral duty of counselors to tell truth to power, on the spiritual dangers of courts where flattery replaced honesty. Preachers used Valdoria as an example in sermons. This is what happens when a kingdom prioritizes appearance over reality, when pride prevents acknowledgement of weakness, when the desire to seem strong overrides the need to be strong. These sermons were not subtle. They were directed at kings and nobles sitting in the congregation, warnings that the same fate could befall any kingdom that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The economic consequences rippled across Europe. The banks that had lent to Valdoria lost fortunes when the kingdom defaulted. This made them more cautious about lending to other kingdoms, which restricted the availability of credit across the continent. Interest rates rose. Kings who had previously been able to borrow easily found capital expensive or unavailable. The financial crisis that started with Valdoria's secret spread through the medieval banking system like a contagion. It took a generation for credit markets to recover. The human consequences were the most devastating. The wars that dismembered Valdoria killed tens of thousands of people. The civil wars and peasant rebellions killed tens of thousands more. Famine followed war, as armies destroyed crops and disrupted trade. Disease followed famine, as malnourished populations succumbed to plague and fever. Entire villages were depopulated. Ancient families were extinguished. Cathedrals and monasteries were sacked. The cultural and material wealth of 3 centuries was destroyed or scattered in 5 years of chaos. Survivors spoke of those years as apocalyptic, as the end of the world they had known. But from the ruins, new things grew. The territories that had been Valdoria developed new identities. They were no longer provinces of a kingdom, but nascent kingdoms in their own right. They developed their own administrative systems, their own military traditions, their own cultural expressions. Within 2 generations, the people who lived in what had been Valdoria's lands thought of themselves not as Valdorians, but as something new. The map had been redrawn, and the people reoriented themselves to the new reality. Some of the systems Theodoric had invented survived the kingdom's collapse and were adapted by its successors. The idea of appointed governors serving limited terms, for instance, proved too useful to abandon entirely. The concept of royal roads and standardized currency spread to other kingdoms. The legal innovations that had given peasants access to royal courts became precedents that later kingdoms followed. Valdoria as a political entity died, but Valdoria as a collection of governmental innovations lived on, incorporated into the systems of the kingdoms that replaced it. What do we learn from this story? What can we carry from medieval Valdoria into our own lives and times? Let me offer 5 gentle lessons, universal truths that transcend the particulars of this one kingdom's fall. First, information is the foundation of power. A ruler who doesn't know the truth cannot rule wisely, no matter how intelligent or well-intentioned they are. Systems of governance must prioritize accurate information flows over comfortable information flows. This means creating channels through which bad news can reach decision makers without being filtered, softened, or suppressed. It means rewarding honesty even when honesty is uncomfortable. It means cultivating a culture where revealing problems is seen as loyalty rather than betrayal. Valdoria fell because its information systems failed, because its culture of governance prioritized appearing successful over being successful, because no one could afford to tell the truth. This is a failure that recurs throughout history, in kingdoms and corporations, in armies and churches, in any organization where the incentives favors deception over disclosure. Second, secrets compound over time. A small deception, maintained, grows into a large one. A hidden problem, unaddressed, becomes an unsolvable crisis. The longer a secret is kept, the more systems it corrupts, the more people it entraps, the harder it becomes to reveal without catastrophic consequences. The lesson is to address problems early, when they're small and solvable, rather than concealing them and hoping they'll resolve themselves. Hope is not a strategy. Concealment is not protection. The ministers who hid Valdoria's bankruptcy thought they were buying time to fix the problem, but what they actually bought was a larger catastrophe later. If they had revealed the financial problems when they first emerged, the kingdom might have survived through austerity measures and prudent reforms. By hiding the problems for decades, they guaranteed that when the truth emerged, it emerged in the worst possible context, during a military crisis that demanded exactly the resources they didn't have. Third, systems can fail even when individuals within them are competent and well-intentioned. The ministers of Valdoria weren't villains. They were capable administrators trapped in a system that punished honesty and rewarded deception. The governors weren't incompetent. They were responding rationally to the incentives they faced. The king wasn't foolish. He was making decisions based on the information his system provided. Everyone was doing their job, following the rules, trying their best, and yet the system produced catastrophic failure. This is the scariest kind of failure, because it means that good people operating in good faith can still destroy everything if the system they are operating within has structural flaws. Fixing this requires not just finding better people, but fixing the system itself, aligning incentives with desired outcomes, creating accountability mechanisms that work, building in redundancy and error checking. It requires recognizing that systems are not neutral tools, but active forces that shape the behavior of everyone within them. Fourth, strength that cannot be tested is not real strength. Valdoria seemed strong for decades because it faced no serious challenges that would reveal its weakness. The governors seemed competent because they were never asked to accomplish anything truly difficult. The treasury seemed full because no one looked too closely at the books. But when real stress arrived, war, invasion, crisis, the appearance of strength vanished, and the reality of weakness was exposed. This is true for individuals as well as kingdoms. We don't know our own limits until they're tested. We don't know the truth about ourselves until we face challenges that force truth to surface. The lesson is not to avoid challenges, but to seek them out at manageable scales, to test ourselves and our systems regularly, so that we discover our weaknesses in conditions where we can address them rather than in crises where they destroy us. Fifth, trust is precious, fragile, and once broken, almost impossible to restore. The greatest damage Valdoria's secret did was not financial, but social. When the truth emerged, it shattered trust between the king and his ministers, between the government and the people, between Valdoria and its creditors, between the crown and the nobility. Without trust, no organization can function. Contracts become meaningless if neither party believes the other will honor them. Commands become unenforceable if subjects don't believe in the authority of those giving orders. Government becomes impossible if citizens don't believe their rulers are acting in good faith. Trust is the invisible foundation of all social order, and, like the foundations of a building, it's only noticed when it fails. Valdoria fell not because it was bankrupt, many kingdoms have been bankrupt and survived, but because the revelation of the bankruptcy destroyed trust so completely that no one would cooperate in the effort to rebuild. This is the final and most enduring cost of the secret, not the immediate crisis it caused, but the long-term impossibility of recovery that it created. These lessons are not merely historical, they apply to every organization, every relationship, every life where trust matters and where hidden problems can grow. The specifics of medieval governance are distant from our modern world, but the dynamics of secrets, lies, trust, and collapse are timeless. We all keep secrets. We all face the temptation to hide problems rather than address them. We all operate within systems that sometimes incentivize the wrong behaviors. We all depend on trust that can be shattered by revelations of long-hidden truths. Valdoria's story is our story, played out in a different key. Let's return to the crown we imagined at the beginning, that hollow crown, beautiful on the outside, but rotting within. The crown is still there, in our minds, but now we understand it differently. We understand that crowns are not just symbols of power, but containers of secrets, that every throne holds hidden truths, that every kingdom has cracks in its foundation that are concealed by the decorative surface. The question is not whether secrets exist, they always exist, but whether we catch them early and address them honestly, or whether we let them grow until they destroy everything we've built. The secret that destroyed Valdoria was small at first, a few ministers concealing a budget shortfall. It seemed manageable, it seemed temporary, it seemed justified. But secrets have their own gravity, their own momentum. They pull more secrets into their orbit. They demand more lies to sustain them. They corrupt systems and entrap people. And eventually, inevitably, they emerge into the light, often at the worst possible moment. And the destruction they cause is proportional not to the original secret, but to the accumulated weight of all the deceptions required to maintain it. If Valdoria teaches us anything, it's this. The secret that saves you today becomes the lie that destroys you tomorrow. The ministers thought they were saving the kingdom by hiding its financial problems. They were actually setting in motion the chain of events that would annihilate it. The lie that seems protective in the moment becomes the weapon that kills in the end. This is not a moral judgment, but a structural observation about how secrets work in systems, how deception compounds, how concealment creates its own destruction. What would have happened if Valdoria's ministers had told the truth early? It's impossible to know with certainty, but we can speculate based on what happened in other medieval kingdoms that faced similar financial crises and addressed them openly. There would have been immediate political crisis. The king might have had to dismiss the ministers responsible for the deficit. Taxes would have been raised, causing unpopularity. Expenses would have been cut, requiring difficult choices about which projects to abandon and which obligations to defer. Foreign creditors would have been renegotiated, accepting partial payment rather than full repayment. The kingdom's reputation would have suffered, but not catastrophically. Life would have become harder for a while, but the kingdom would have survived. Instead, by hiding the problem, the ministers turned a manageable crisis into an existential catastrophe. They traded short-term stability for long-term destruction. They bought peace in their time at the cost of war in their children's time. This is the bargain that secrets always offer: comfort now, in exchange for devastation later. Sometimes the bargain is worth it. Sometimes the short-term benefit outweighs the long-term cost. But far more often than we like to admit, we make this trade without understanding the true price. And by the time we understand, it's too late to change course. The people of Valdoria, living through the collapse, didn't fully understand what had happened to them. They experienced the wars, the famines, the destruction, but they didn't know about the secret that had started it all. The ministers who knew were dead, executed in the early days of the crisis. The records they had kept were burned in the sack of the capital. The truth was buried under layers of immediate catastrophe. For generations afterward, historians debated why Valdoria fell. Some blamed Aldrich for incompetence. Some blamed bad luck. Some blamed divine judgment for the kingdom's sins. Only much later, when a scholar studying in a monastery discovered a letter written by one of the executed ministers and hidden in the binding of an old manuscript, did the true story emerge. The scholar published his findings, and suddenly Valdoria's collapse made sense. It wasn't mystery or tragedy or divine will. It was the predictable consequence of a sustained deception that corrupted the systems meant to prevent exactly such a deception. This delayed understanding is also characteristic of secret-driven collapses. The people experiencing them often don't know why everything is falling apart. The immediate causes, wars, rebellions, famines, are visible. But the underlying cause, the secret that weakened the foundations, remains hidden. Only later, when documents surface or witnesses come forward or scholars piece together evidence, does the true story emerge. By then, it's too late to matter for the people who lived through it, but it can serve as a warning for others. This is why we study history, why we excavate the stories of fallen kingdoms and failed states, why we examine the secret mechanisms of collapse. Not because we can change what happened to Valdoria, but because we can learn to recognize the patterns before they destroy us. The crown, hollow and rotting, is still there in our imagination. But now we see it more clearly. We see that its beauty was maintained by constant effort, constant concealment, constant lies. We see that what looked like strength was carefully maintained weakness. We see that the system designed to make it strong had made it brittle. And we see finally that when the truth emerged and the crown fell, it shattered completely because there was nothing solid left inside it to hold it together. This is the image we should carry forward, not the crown at the height of its glory, but the crown at the moment of its breaking, when the hollow interior is finally revealed. That moment of revelation is the moment of truth, the moment when appearances fall away and reality stands exposed. It's a terrifying moment, but it's also a clarifying one. In that moment, we finally see what was real and what was illusion, what was strong and what was merely painted to look strong, what could survive and what was always destined to fall. Valdoria's crown shattered, the kingdom fell, the map changed, but the story survived and the lessons survived, and now we carry them forward into our own time. We know to watch for secrets that grow. We know to question systems that discourage honesty. We know to test our strength before crisis forces the test upon us. We know to value truth over comfort and reality over appearance. We know that the secret that saves us today might destroy us tomorrow. These lessons are Valdoria's legacy, more enduring than any of the kingdom's material achievements. The roads have crumbled, the cathedrals have fallen, the coins have been melted down and reminted. But the warning remains: beware the hollow crown, the beautiful lie, the secret that grows in darkness until it devours everything in light. As you drift towards sleep tonight, hold that image gently. A crown in shadow, magnificent but hollow, strong in appearance but rotting within, maintained by lies until the moment of truth arrives and everything falls. Hold it not as a nightmare, but as a reminder, a warning, a lesson. And perhaps in your own life, in your own systems, in your own relationships, you'll recognize the early signs of the hollow crown before it's too late to fill it with truth. The candle we imagined at the beginning has burned down now, its flame small and steady, casting long shadows on stone walls. Those shadows contain all the stories we've walked through tonight. The ministers keeping their secret, the king trusting his system, the army marching to defeat, the kingdom unraveling, the truth emerging too late to save anything. The shadows dance and flicker, but they cannot change what happened. They can only remind us, gently and persistently, that secrets cast shadows, that lies create darkness, that the only light that survives is the light of truth, however painful that truth might be. Sleep now, knowing that kingdoms rise and fall, that secrets grow and are revealed, that crowns gleam and shatter, that everything built on lies eventually collapses, but everything built on truth, however humble, however difficult, has a chance to endure. The secret that destroyed Valdoria was kept to save the kingdom, but it destroyed what it meant to protect. Let that be the lesson we carry forward, that protection without truth is not protection at all, that strength that cannot be tested is not real strength, that the foundation must be solid even if admitting its cracks is painful, because a cracked foundation can be repaired, but a hidden crack will eventually bring everything down. Return tomorrow night, or whenever you need another journey through the medieval world, and we'll walk a different road together, finding new stories, new lessons, new reminders of how human nature works across the centuries. Until then, rest in the knowledge that the hollow crown has fallen, the secret has been revealed, and from the ruins, truth has finally emerged to build something new.